This is a review of God of the Sun by Kimberly Loth. It is an indie book, and it's quite short, so it was a very fast read, which is good because it did have a few problems, which I will talk about. As I was reading this, especially in the beginning, I wasn't sure that I was enjoying it enough that I would want to read the second book, and yet by the end of this book, I did decide that I really needed to find out what happened in the second book of this series. So I want to talk about also what went right, and what I did like about it, and what I liked about it enough that I felt like it was worth reading the second book of the series. But I also have to address some of the real problems that I found with this book. Just a side note, I'm going to try and keep all my reviews to 10 minutes. I haven't been doing a very good job of that. I've had some really long reviews lately. If you like the long reviews, if you prefer those, then certainly let me know in the comments. But I'm assuming that most people prefer a shorter review and not me just rambling for an hour. So I'm going to try and do that. I'm also going to try and do more editing when I'm actually doing the review. I have a terrible cough right now, and what you don't hear is that I'm coughing all through this dictation, and because I'm coughing, it sounds terrible, and I feel the need that I have to edit that out. Now what I'm trying to do is edit it out as I make the recording. I know the sound quality is also better when I record inside the studio or inside my office. I can't do that all the time. Today I'm doing it again when I walk my dog, and I know it's noisier when I do that. I apologize for the sound. I simply don't have time to make all the recordings otherwise. I basically squeeze every moment of my day with some activity. So I just push everything as much as I can, and that's how it is. So I'd rather actually bring you a video, even if it's just a little bit more noisy. I just beg your forgiveness. On to God of the Sun. I thought this would be a fantasy romance. Then when I started reading it, I thought, wait a minute, is this science fiction? It sounded very science fiction-y to me. One reason was because the premise seemed very dystopian, very science fiction dystopian. But another reason was the language that the author used simply didn't sound fantasy. It was very modern. There was a lot of slang, very contemporary slang. It wasn't a made-up slang just for this world. It was common slang, and it just sounded so casual, a lot of young adult first-person books have this very casual conversational tone, but they're set in a period where it makes sense for the character to talk like that. I don't think that a fantasy world, it's very realistic for a princess to be using casual slang of modern teenagers. So I found that very jarring, and I definitely didn't find that in keeping with good world building. Next on my list of petty gripes is the character was very shallow, very immature. Now, the author, to her credit, was aware of this. She attempted to compensate for it with two techniques, which somewhat worked. One technique was that the character was also aware that she was an immature person, that even though she was destined to be queen, she was completely not qualified for that position. And honestly, even though her constantly trying to get out of her responsibility was part of what actually made her immature, the fact that she knew she wasn't responsible and didn't want to be, did at least her self-awareness made her more likable. And I actually thought it was relatable for her to say, I'm not a leader. I shouldn't be a leader because that's not who I am. It should be given to somebody who likes to lead people. That made sense to me, and I can kind of relate to that. The other thing that the author showed us was there was a reason that the heroine was like this, that she was raised to be more of a follower than a leader, even though she was destined to be queen and people in her society knew that. Again, this was a dystopia, and so the true authorities of this society did not actually want her to have leadership qualities or think for herself. And so I begin to see the glimmer of a pretty cool story arc where the heroine would begin to mature, basically, and fight against this aspect of her society and realize that she had been trained to be a toy poodle, basically, and that she would overcome this. But the pace was going a little slow for me. There were a lot of scenes that seemed to be going nowhere, especially at the beginning of the book. And because of the quality of the writing itself at a sentence-by-sentence level, I wasn't sure that I trusted the author to take this story arc there, to mature this character. I was afraid, am I going to be reading a series where she's just immature from beginning to end, and I thought I was going to get a growth story, and I don't. I don't want to waste my time with it if that's going to be the case. Now, the other reason that I didn't trust the writer was because the scenery in this story was completely lacking. I talk about this in my video, How to Set a Scene. I complain that some authors, and I'm afraid that it is especially true of indie authors, do not have the descriptive power. They don't invite us into the world. They don't describe anything. I had white room syndrome so many times in this book, beginning in the very first chapter. And even in other scenes where she talks about what's going on or where they are, it's very, very generic. It's a throne room, and that's all we get. It's a bedroom, that's all we get. It's somebody's house, that's all we get. Again, this is fantasy, science fiction. One of the other reasons I couldn't really set it in my mind is that sometimes it seemed like she was setting it in a medieval setting, but other times it seemed completely modern and technologically sophisticated. Nothing was brought clear enough into our mind's eye so that we could really see and taste and smell and feel like we were really there. It's a pity that the world building was so weak because it could have potentially been one of the strongest things about this book. One of the things that happens to you if you're a writer is you get a great idea and you think, nobody in the history of the universe has ever thought of this really cool idea. And then as soon as you start researching it, you realize lots of other authors have had this idea and it's been done a million times before. That doesn't necessarily mean don't write about it, by the way. It's just a little disconcerting. So I had this idea for a book once. It was on a planet. It would have to be science fiction because it would be a planet where one side faces the sun and the other never sees the sun. And so you have two species, humanoid, but they evolve completely separately, probably from a common ancestor. But one is adapted to the intense daylight and one is adapted to the intense night. When I read the write-up for this book and I saw that one place was called Stella and the other was Sol, I thought, this is what is going on here. She's taken my idea. Oh my gosh. But I was still really excited about seeing another author do it. Again, that's why it seemed to me like science fiction, because I thought, well, that has to be because of a planet, right? But in this book, it doesn't seem like that's the reason. It seems there's just a spell. So one place is eternally in night, one is eternally in day, and there's this mystical wall which separates them. Okay, so I can go with the fantasy version of that idea. It's still interesting. But again, this is one of the ideas in the book that is so important to the story, and yet it doesn't feel completely fleshed out or brought to life. But whatever, that was a little nitpick. What I was more concerned about was that this idea and then another really cool idea in the book was thrown out there a little too hastily without enough development to really make me feel the danger and the power and the vividness of it. The other awesome concept in this book that wasn't developed as well as it could have been, although I'd say it was probably the most well-developed idea in the book, was that it was a dystopia, as I said. So there's this voice, and it's not the voice of your conscience. It's like the voice of at first I thought it was like a supercomputer that monitors everybody's thought and then constantly picks at them, like having a parent over your shoulder constantly. If you stick your tongue out at someone and says, don't behave badly, that's rude. And then if you do something even more transgressive, it gives you a little electric shock of pain. And if you break the law, it will actually torture you. And the only way to get relief from the torture is for your relatives to appeal on your behalf to one of the people in the government. In this case, it's the princess's brother who takes that position. I think it's called the chancellor or something like that. So this voice works the same way. It's this arbitrary authority, and it turns out that it is not just a spell, but it almost works exactly like a computer program. There's an algorithm that applies the daily supervision to everybody, but then it turns out there's a person, sort of like a one-man bureaucracy almost, and he's like this hidden person. We never know who he is in the book, although we see him behind the scenes, and he has these spells and these glowing balls behind the scenes, and including the people who are being tortured, and he's supposed to look into their cases, and he just leaves them on the desk because he doesn't have time because he's so overwhelmed with work. That was really funny, actually. I really liked that angle of the story, and I thought that was pretty cool dystopian world building right there. We started to see more of this as the book went on, and that's why I started to really get into the story. And so by the end of it, I was very invested in this world, and I did want to find out what's going to happen. Who is the voice really? There's another character that the voice is talking to, and we don't know who that is either. We don't know which one is good and which one is evil. So it started to get more complicated and more interesting as the book went on. And I've already passed the 10-minute mark on my recording at least. So I'm going to try and just wrap this up. The final thing that I didn't like at first and then kind of sold me was the romance. Now, again, I thought this was going to be a fantasy romance, and it turns out it was a fantasy romance, but I didn't like the romance at first at all, in part because the heroine was so immature, and the person that I thought she was having the romance was a slave. I thought she was very disrespectful to him. She was putting his life in danger, literally, by hanging out with him. She was the princess. They were going to let her off the hook if they got caught together, but he could have been killed for it, and I was like, you love this person, but you're putting him in danger? What is wrong with you? Plus, she acted like a child with him. She wanted to play tag. She wanted to play all these childish games with him. It was very immature and ridiculous, and I just couldn't buy it as a love story. Didn't see this couple at all. I did not like this ship. Then, toward the end of the book, the other guy appears, and now suddenly I realize, oh, wait a minute. this is the real love interest, not this first one. Maybe the author is going to try to make it a love triangle, but I'm not sure if that's really where she's taking it. I think that in some areas she was a little more skillful than I gave her credit for based on her lack of descriptions and her lack of good scenery. Because some of the character development I really started to like toward the end as I saw, okay, she knows that first love affair is completely stupid and she did it on purpose because the real point of it was to give the heroine a motive and to set up the plot for the real romance when that prince of the enemy people shows up. And this is also when we started to get toward the, I love the motif of the marriage of the sun and moon. And when I was looking at this story, prince from the land of night and a princess from the land of day. That's like the essence of the marriage of the sun and moon motif, right? And I was so disappointed at the beginning because it didn't seem like she was going in that direction. And then she brought in this prince from the Nightland, from Stella, the land of the stars, and I thought, okay, this is cool. Finally, I'm finally getting into this. And then there's a little trick because each of them, they end up having to get married, but each of them has an ulterior motive, and then they get angry at each other when they each find out the ulterior motive, and that's where the book ended. So it ended on a cliffhanger, and that totally did sell me on the second book. Again, this was such a short book that if it were published by a mainstream publisher, this probably would have been just the first third of a book of some 600-page, huge, hefty volume. So I didn't mind getting a second book. It was also a lot cheaper than a traditionally published book, so I also didn't mind. So it's not that I felt bad about having a cliffhanger ending. It worked for me. So I probably will wait a while to read the second book. I think I won't read sequels in the same month that I read the first one, if I can avoid it. So I'll probably read it for next month's book haul, although I've already bought it. What I'm looking for in that second book is more development of the characters and hopefully a little more fleshed out world building than in the first book. Of course, I'd also like the mysteries to be resolved. That would be helpful. Although I don't know how many books there are in the series, if it's a trilogy or a duology. So far, I only have the 2 books. I've already gone to almost 15 minutes, so I'm going to wrap this up. But the main problem with this book was the White Room Syndrome. With a little more careful stage setting, this could have been an absolutely fantastic dystopia. As it was a little weak. I'm hoping that this is going to improve as we go along. The book itself improved, and I'm hoping the series as a whole will improve as we go along. Okay, Tara out.